Let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns and Kevin Cirilli. Caitlin is a CBSN political contributor and a national political reporter for Real Clear Politics. And Kevin is the chief Washington correspondent for Bloomberg. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having me.
So much to talk about. Let's talk about Syria, first of all. The White House, as we know, put out some mixed messages when it comes to what the next steps are in Syria and with President Bashar al-Assad. Let's take a listen to some of that.
We can navigate a political outcome in which the Syrian people, in fact, will determine Bashar al-Assad's fate.
Is it a priority of U.S. policy to get him out of power?
Our priority in Syria, John, really hasn't changed. I think the president's been quite clear. First and foremost, we must defeat ISIS.
What is now the priority in Syria? Assad's removal or defeating ISIS? Before, the emphasis was on defeating ISIS, then we'll deal with Assad. Has that changed?
Well, I think what you have to understand is we can have multiple priorities. So, of course it's to defeat ISIS. There's not any sort of option where a political solution is going to happen with Assad at the head of the regime. It just, if you look at his actions, if you look at the situation, it's going to be hard to see a government that's peaceful and stable with Assad.
Is it two separate tracks at the same time, or does ISIS have to happen first before we and the international community move to depose Assad?
Well, I think as you saw with the strike, that there has to be a degree of simultaneous activity as well as a sequencing of the defeat of ISIS first.
Okay, I'm confused by that. Simultaneous activity as well as a sequencing. Kevin, let me start with you. What do you think is behind these mixed messages on Syria?
I think it's by design. And I think when you take a look back to last week, in particular, when President Trump was sitting across with President Xi at the dinner table at Mar-a-Lago. Meanwhile, U.S. forces are literally, during this dinner conversation, dropping bombs in Syria. That is clearly sending a message that they are going to reverse the policy of former President Barack Obama and flip it completely heading into this administration. They're not just sending a signal to Syria, by the way. They're sending a signal to North Korea, China, and Russia.
So, Caitlin, at the same time, though, what we heard from those officials seemed to be a range of positions here. I mean, what accounts for that? Because typically what you'll have is one unified message coming out of an administration.
Particularly on Sunday shows, because that sets the message for the rest of the week, and those are highly coordinated. But we did see in instances over the campaign when Trump would kind of test different kinds of messages, right? It's very much looking at public opinion also, which shows high support, as the CBS poll shows, for the strikes, but also a reluctance to really get involved. Remember, people are still pretty war-weary. So the focus on Assad, whether to take him out, whether that should be the focus, seems to be up for debate, whether that's the U.S. involvement or whether the Syrian people should, as Tillerson has alluded to. What's really key here, though, is that Tillerson is the one that's going to Moscow later this week. We're not exactly clear who he's meeting, whether he'll meet exactly with Putin. If he does, that's significant, particularly as it pertains to these talks.
I know, it's going to be such a fascinating meeting. But let's talk about this first 100 days concept, Kevin, because, typically this is the time when people look to an administration's accomplishments. I mean, we should point out, this is not an actual sort of hard and fast thing. This is kind of created. Yeah. Right, exactly. There's no actual report card that's given. However, it is an opportunity to kind of reflect and take a look at what's been accomplished. My question is, Kevin, is it fair to measure this administration's quote-unquote success in the same way that we've measured administrations in the past? We just spelled out all those things at the top of the show, but some of his supporters might argue, you know what, you're not dealing with a conventional administration.
Exactly, and I think Caitlin makes a great point about all eyes being on Secretary Tillerson on Wednesday, because that could be a potential for them to see if they're able to get some type of benchmark. But look, I think there's two things you have to look at. First and foremost, what are they doing outside of Congress? And the administration officials that I speak with say, well, look at consumer confidence, look at economic confidence, look at things like manufacturing jobs. They didn't have the best jobs report on Friday that they would have wanted, but they still see some signs of growth in that jobs report. They look at Syria as a way, again, of reshaping the narrative with his series of executive orders. But then you take a look at his relationship with Congress, a Republican-controlled Congress, by the way, and a Congress that they said if it was Republican-controlled, they would be able to repeal parts of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. They weren't able to do that. So if you look at the report card, so to speak, the one glaring omission on that report card would have to be the Affordable Care Act. But I was talking with some folks today. They still feel they have time, but I think it's a little bit mixed in that relationship with Congress, and it's Republican controlled.
Right, and it's hard to tell what's going to actually change here, right, if these sides are so entrenched. But Caitlin, let me ask you, does the report card matter? I mean, you've got this reporting out now that they're really struggling in the Trump White House to figure out how to frame and brand, quote unquote, the first 100 days along the lines that you're talking about, the economic successes that it perceives and all of that. But does it matter?
Well, I think actually the strike on Thursday or Friday, when was it?
It was Thursday night. It was actually Thursday night, but Friday morning.
Friday morning.
Yes.
This, I think, really changes the dynamic here, because now you have a president who has been thrust into foreign policy, not necessarily something that he campaigned on. Remember, he campaigned on this America First type of policy, working on, economic issues here at home, domestic issues, economic populism, as Steve Bannon has called it. Now we are wading into a different kind of territory. We've seen the president's approval rating hit an all-time low last week in the RealClearPolitics polling average. It has ticked up slightly over the course of the coming days, because I do think Trump has been able to show his decision-making power and the effects of that decision, and he was highly praised for that decision. But there is still a big question mark about what comes next. And as we know, lawmakers are now on 2-week recess, going home to their constituents without much to give them, without anything really to sell them. Lawmakers were trying to, huddle around and propose a tiny part of the health care bill that they could go back and sell. But again, they are dealing with a still largely unpopular president and really no policy initiative. So if you grade him on that scale, that's one thing. But I think your question is really interesting. And I think that kind of applies to the whole administration, how you can grade this one compared to others.
Yeah, you talk about Republican lawmakers here. So Congress has left Washington, Kevin. They're going to be back right before the 100-day mark here. What do you think it's going to be like for these lawmakers when they go back to their home districts? I mean, we'd already seen the reception that some folks had gotten just a few weeks ago, where you had people who were en masse organized in those town halls and really letting lawmakers have it.
Mark your calendar, because April 28th is the date that everybody in Washington is circling on their calendar, because that, of course, is the date that lawmakers have to pass some type of partial spending bill in order to avert a partial government shutdown. Now, I've spoken with some aides to some members, Republican members of Congress, and the division that we saw on health care between the more conservative members, the House Freedom Caucus, Tea Party members, versus the more moderate members of the Republican caucus, they don't think that will be on display for April 28th. However, I do think you are going to see some political fireworks, because in order to keep the government open, you have to spend more money. A lot of folks in the Republican Party aren't so sure that they like that government spending.
And interestingly, there's not much appetite among Democrats to have a government shutdown, which is a big difference. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I think those dynamics will be highlighted in the Republican Party for sure.
Something to watch. All right, let's talk about some of this palace intrigue, because there are reports that on Friday, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus ordered this face-to-face meeting here for Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner to basically clear the air, as well as their senior teams. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer was asked about this. Let's go ahead and listen to some of that.
I said this multiple times throughout the transition, that everybody that came into this administration, while they might have a personal view or an action on an issue, they understand and understood and understand the president's vision and agenda. And their goal of coming into this was to understand, first and foremost, that it is the president who made pledges and promises to the American people about the direction he'd take this country and the actions he's taken.
Sean Spicer responding to our Major Garrett there, by the way, during the briefing. But, interestingly, so we saw Steve Bannon removed from his role in the National Security Council. What's the significance of the movement that we've seen so far, and also this quote-unquote détente, Kevin?
Well, when I speak with some aides within the White House, as well as outside of the White House, familiar with the Trump administration, they say that this is the type of atmosphere that, quite frankly, we all saw and reported on during the campaign. And I think what's interesting is how this type of work culture, which does have similarities, weirdly enough, to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her political orbit.
Really? So it's similar?
It's similar in the dysfunction, like a dysfunctional family. It's politics. It's American politics.
And D.C. and New York.
Right, and D.C. But I think what I'm more interested in is, how does that type of work culture translate into policy? Mm-hmm. And when you look at what happened on healthcare, I think what was interesting was the House Freedom Caucus was negotiating with the Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, the former chairman of the Republican Party. Now, anyone who, I mean, let's be blunt here. Reince Priebus doesn't necessarily have the most open lines of communication with the Freedom Caucus members. And that, from a policy standpoint, Caitlin, I'm interested in your take on this, is I think perhaps why they were not able to negotiate, because they weren't able to negotiate for years before this. So it's kind of really no surprise.
Yeah, what do you think about that? I mean, that the conduit here in the form of Reince Priebus is not necessarily the best way to reach out to those people in the House Freedom Caucus and people who think similarly.
Right. It's really interesting because from the outset, having Bannon and Priebus kind of share this role, I don't see how that could have ever really ended quite well. Then you have Jared Kushner, whose portfolio is expanding by the minute, it seems, really playing that kind of chief of staff role almost, and he was notably absent during those healthcare talks. We're always interested in palace intrigue, and it is highly dramatic in this particular White House. Why I think it's really important now, though, why Americans should be paying attention to these types of maneuverings is because Syria is taking center stage now. There is a possibility. Americans are wondering, what are our next steps? Who is going to be advising this president? Who is he listening to when it comes to the role of commander-in-chief? And I think that's really weighing on people's minds right now with that uncertainty.
Yeah, it's important to know who exactly is influencing the president.
And I would just argue, I think it's Secretary Tillerson as well as General H.R. McMaster. I think those folks who, quite frankly, aren't in the tabloid political press as much, that I think we've seen over the past 72 hours in the fallout of Syria. And as we head into Secretary Tillerson traveling now overseas and leading up to Russia on Wednesday, I think we're starting to see that more serious type of rhetoric coming from those cabinet level officials.
What are you going to be looking for out of that trip?
Whether Russia plays ball. I mean, will they stand him up? Will they have any political hiccups? I mean, just the optics. We talk so much about palace intrigue, but we also have to talk about optics, about how these photo ops, these personal chemistries, whether it's with German Chancellor Angela Merkel or President Xi, who waited, by the way, to release a statement, the Chinese waited to release a statement criticizing the administration on their relationship with Syria and their handling of that until after. All of that matters. And so if he shows up to Moscow and is greeted or not greeted, all of that matters about whether or not Russians and Vladimir Putin are respecting this administration.
And I think your point about Tillerson playing a more public role, being on the Sunday shows, for example, he's notably media shy. I'm fascinated by that dynamic, too, because you assume then that he is speaking, he is on the same page as the president if they're sending him to Moscow. So we might learn something about where Trump stands when it comes to Vladimir Putin.
It'll be so interesting to see the dynamics there. All right, Caitlin, Huey-Burns and Kevin Cirilli, thank you both so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.